Hi, I'm Ashy, and today we're going to talk a little bit more about color theory, but specific to watercolor paints. Because though color is very important, two paints may be pretty much the same color, but they can react completely different. So even if they look the same when they're in the pan, they can react completely different once you add them to water or put them on the page. So let's go ahead and flow into this conversation about pigment properties. So some of the properties of watercolor paint that we talk about when we talk about pigment properties are the opacity versus transparency. So that's how much white of the page is going to show through the paint as you lay it down. We talk about staining. So that's, what it sounds like, the characteristic of the paint to actually stain the page versus kind of sit on top of the page and be workable and be able to move it around or lift it. And then we also talk about granulation, which I'll show you some examples of. So let's just start by looking at these two colors here. So this is Ultramarine blue and this is Winsor Blue red shade. These are both Winsor & Newton professional grade paints that I bought in tubes and squeezed into my palette. So they're both similar colors when we look at them just kind of in the blob in the pan, right? But let's take some of that paint, and I just sprayed these down very generously so they're nice and activated. And I'm just going to take some of this paint and put it on the page, okay? And this is the ultramarine, okay? And then I'm going to pull some of that down just so that we get a nice big swatch. And then we're going to rinse the brush thoroughly and get some of the Winsor Blue red shade, okay? So even though they look the same in the pan, we can see that the colors themselves are a little bit different, but they're not crazy different to where it would necessarily make like the biggest difference in your painting if you were just looking at the colors of these. You could probably use these fairly interchangeably and get similar results. This is a little bit more purple, but it's similar, right? But then if we look at our other properties, if we continue to shear this one out, we can get it to basically nothing, right? So it's pretty transparent. And the ultramarine, we can do the same thing. It's pretty transparent, right? So our transparency is similar on this. Both of these are considered transparent paints. Now let's see if we add some more water and kind of scrub it around and see what happens. Okay, and we'll kind of let that dry now. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here. So I don't know if you can tell here, as I'm moving this paint around, it's kind of lifting off and lightening up a lot more. This is just getting more textured, okay? And then we'll see as it dries kind of what that looks like. Okay, so that's kind of looking at some lifting when the paint's wet, okay? So staining can talk about when the paint's wet and lifting. So this is still wet, and see how I can lift that off. This is also still wet, and let's lift, okay? So they both lift when they're wet pretty well. This one is basically back to the white of the page. This one though, you can see in some of the texture on the page, there's still some blue marks, okay? So that's lifting while it's wet. We'll look at lifting while it's dry also. But one reason that that's happening with ultramarine and not Winsor Blue red shade is because ultramarine is a granulating paint. So granulating paints have these little chunks almost of pigment. And so this is a natural pigment that's ground down, and the pigment particles just tend to be a little bit larger. Most ultramarines, if not all, are granulating. And so those heavier pigments will settle down into the texture of the paper. So if you have a more textured paper, you're going to see it even more. This is a cold press, and it's a smoother cold press. It's Bong Academy sketchbook, and it's a little bit smoother than like a typical cold press, but it still has some texture. But you're going to see the texture occur, especially in these areas that have kind of a moderate amount of water. The lighter areas, it looks smoother, and the darker areas, it's a little textured, but it still looks smoother. But in the middle here, you have these areas that are much more textured, whereas here, it's much more of a smooth wash because this doesn't have those heavier, bigger particle pigments. So you're gonna get completely different effects. So if you're looking for nice, smooth, flat washes, let's say for a sky, maybe instead of choosing ultramarine, you might want to choose the Winsor Blue. And you can also lift off easier for making clouds. When I added the water, you can see how it really pushes the pigment away to create that soft textured edge. Whereas on the ultramarine, it's a little bit, it doesn't push it away as much, right? This is still a lot more colored and granulated here. So it just exposes the granulation more when you add the water and push it around. Whereas this one, it really can create some nice soft white areas. Okay, so if you're looking for more texture, you might want to choose a granulating paint. If you're looking for things that are going to lift easier, typically your granulating paints are not going to lift as completely because those particles are seeping into or sinking into those valleys in the page. So it's going to be harder to lift. Even if they're not necessarily considered staining, they are going to be a little bit harder to lift than your smoother non-granulating paints. So this is just one example, but it's really important to get to know your colors so that you know these things, so that when you go to pick colors, you're not just looking at, well, I like this kind of purpley shade of blue, but maybe I don't want granulation. So maybe I'm going to mix instead and take some of my Winsor Blue and mix it with just a little bit of permanent rose to try to make it closer to the ultramarine color. So that's exactly what this is. This is the Winsor Blue with some permanent rose. Okay. And I can make it that more purpley color, but have some of those properties of the Winsor Blue instead of the ultramarine. So it's going to be smoother. Okay. So it's something to think about. And if you're wanting to lift, for example, the example I gave here was clouds, you want to be able to have a paint that's not staining, okay? So I showed you the lifting ability when it was wet. Now these are dry-ish, mostly dry. So let's see if we can lift while they're dry. So I'm gonna take a brush that's just got a little bit of water on it, and I'm gonna add some water here, and then lift it away. And you can see the same thing is happening with the ultramarine that happened when it was wet. The granulated part is kind of staying there. Okay. Now we're going to check out our Winsor Blue red shade. So when you look at this, I'm scrubbing here. Okay. And it is not really lifting much. So that tells me that if I want to get back to a really nice bright white highlight with this Winsor Blue, it's staining. Once it's dry, it does not want to move much. I can move a little bit, but it is not lifting like it did when it was wet. Okay. So some paints you'll notice that even when they're wet, they just want to stay on the page. And other paints, when they're wet, you can manipulate them, but when they dry, they're staining. So that's, again, something to know about this paint. And this is my palette, so I'm just kind of playing with it and learning my own paints. You need to do this for your own palette as well. And you can do it in paintings if you want, if that's kind of how you like to learn, by trial and error. That's no problem at all. Definitely, when you're doing that, you want to make sure that you don't set super high expectations for those paintings, because it might not react the way that you were hoping or expecting it to. So you always have to be a little bit flexible if you're learning that way. And if you are a little bit more of a planner and kind of a precise person, then you might want to do pages like this for your different colors, where you're testing out the transparency, the staining properties, how it lifts when it's wet, how it lifts when it's dry, how it reacts to adding a bunch of water, if it creates blooms easily. So all of that stuff is things that you can figure out by doing sheets like this, or during actual paintings, again, that are more that you kind of treat as practice paintings, so that you're not disappointed with the results if the paint doesn't react the way you want, because it's not a reflection on your skills if the paint doesn't do what you expected. It's just a reflection of you not knowing your materials that well. So if that's what you're using the paintings for, to get to know the materials, you need to have that expectation that this is not reflective of my painting skills. This is for me to learn this specific part of watercolor painting. So just my little tidbit. So everybody learns differently. So do what works for you. So both of these pigments are, obviously blues, and they're both transparent. So if I were to lay down some yellow, okay, I'm just going to do a nice thick swatch of yellow here and let that dry, then I can layer over that yellow and create some nice glazing with both of these paints. Okay, so glazing is where you use a transparent, so a light transparent layer over another color or over another layer to build up value or detail or shift colors. So on, if I take the ultramarine and I take a little bit more of this paint and I glaze it over, it's going to be transparent. And so those first details are still going to show, but I'm darkening the value. So you can still see this edge here, but now it's a darker value here than it is here because I glazed over it. Okay, so both of these are going to glaze well because they're transparent watercolors, and they keep that luminosity with the layers. But then if I were to take a color that is opaque, so I'm just going to grab one that I know is opaque, and we'll keep it in the same family. So I'm going to use indigo. Okay, so this is indigo. It's another blue, and I'm getting quite a bit of water here, and then I'm going to layer that over. Okay, and you can see that just completely wiped out everything underneath. Okay, I'm going to take it up here. I added more water. So if you add enough water, it becomes transparent, but not as transparent still as transparent paints. But like here, you can't see that underlayer at all. Okay, so this is kind of a similar amount of water here as here. So it has some transparency still. You can water it down to get transparency. You can do the same thing with gouache and watercolor as well. And acrylic as well. You can water it down to get transparency. But if you compare here, where I layered the transparent paint over, and here where I layered an opaque paint, you can tell that this has more of that kind of glowing luminosity that's associated with traditional watercolor, and this is a little bit more dull. So some people consider when you kind of layer more opaque that it gets muddy faster. To me, it's just dull, and it's not a bad thing. Muddy always has a negative connotation to me, but if that's the look you're going for, that's not negative. That's just a technique that you're using and you're trying to achieve a certain look. So to me, this looks fine. It depends on what I'm painting though. So if you want to maintain that light luminous effect, stick with your transparent colors. But opaque colors come in very handy when you want to go over things, obviously, and want to obscure what's beneath, which is sometimes a goal. Okay, so now that this yellow's dry, I can kind of show you the effect over yellow instead of over the same color of blue. So this is the ultramarine. Okay, and I'm just going to glaze it over. Okay. And then I'm going to take some of the Winsor Blue red shade and glaze that over. Okay, and the colors themselves are going to be different because this is a slightly more green blue and this is a slightly more purple blue. So this is going to make a brighter green. And that's not what we're really looking at here. We're just looking at the effects of the transparency. Okay, and then I'm going to take some of the indigo, make sure I have enough water, and then layer that over. Okay, so you can see the difference there between the more opaque paint, especially as you get to if layering it over the lighter washes, right? You are kind of not seeing the yellow. It is turning green. That's called optical mixing, where it mixes on the page. So they're all turning green. But this one, it's almost like you can see blue over yellow. And this one looks more like it's a mixed green, which is a weird kind of thing to think about. But I mean, here you can definitely see like there's yellow underneath that. This one, it's more blendy. And this edge is not as defined because the indigo is more opaque than the Winsor Blue. So I mentioned kind of the staining properties a little bit and tested it with the paint being wet and the paint being dry, and it got different results. So I do have a page here where I just went through and was swatching a bunch of my paints, and this is kind of how I am. I'm chaos when I'm doing this. But I just swatched a bunch of my paints and then kind of dragged them out so that I had a gradient and then let them dry and then came back and tested the lifting ability. And so I can get a good idea of like, well, this one has a lot more texture than this one just by looking at these swatches. And I didn't label them. I do know which paint is which. So I know all these. And so now having done this, I can see those properties of, what is staining, what is lifting. So, these reds are pretty staining. The reds and purples are all pretty staining. And then, I have my greens, like this is sap green, and it lifts very well. Okay, so I know that the importance of that is lifting is a way to kind of correct mistakes sometimes in watercolor, which can be important if that's a goal that you have where you'd rather lift it out than kind of like try to cover it or manipulate it in another way. But it's also important for creating highlights. So sometimes you're going to paint around a highlight, but other times it's going to be a lot easier to lift a highlight out. So knowing which paints can lift is very important. So one big area that we often use lifting is like clouds. We can use the brush or even a towel or a paper towel or something, tissue, to lift out clouds. But if you have a staining paint, then you're not going to get like bright white clouds that you might want. So that's important to know that you might want to lift it when it's wet. For example, the Winsor Blue red shade, like if I lifted wet, I could get that bright white cloud back. But with Ultramarine, I couldn't. And if I waited until it was dry and tried to add water back in, reactivate it and lift, it didn't work on the Winsor Blue. So things like that are important to know. And then again, with the granulation, there are typical pigments that are just known to be granulating. So Ultramarine is one of them. It's a natural pigment made from a stone that is just going to be granulating. There are some synthetic versions that don't granulate, but for the most part, if it's a true ultramarine, it's going to be a granulating paint. Potter's Pink is another one. It's like a very muted earthy pink, and it granulates as well. And then you have your cobalts. So cobalt blue, cobalt green, those are also going to granulate. So if you like the texture and of the granulation, you might gravitate toward those pigments. There are sets in different ranges, different brands of paints that are all granulating. And then there's like super granulators that even have forced granulation. And there are mediums that you can add to the paint that's granulation medium. So if you just add a little bit of that to your water, it will force even non-granulating paints to granulate some and granulating paints to granulate even more. So if you want to explore that, some areas that you might want to use granulating paints would be like in landscapes. for foliage, rocks, sand, all those things that have a natural texture to them, you might want to have some granulation in your palette, some granulating paints to use and to select from. Typically, you know, maybe your sky, you wouldn't want granulating because you want a nice smooth wash. So knowing the difference is important. Other times though, like I've used ultramarine and burnt sienna as a mix in my skies to make kind of a moody fall sky, and it's beautiful, and the granulation works. It just depends what look you're going for, but again, you want to know those things in advance. Typically, if you're painting a finished completed painting that you like are wanting to hang on the wall, you're probably going to want to know how your pigments, how your paints are going to react. So another area of kind of understanding your paints is not just the pigment properties of staining, granulation, and transparency, but also how they react to water. So some paints are going to just explode in water, and other paints are going to just kind of sit there and be a little bit more subdued. And this depends on not just the pigment or paint, you know, the pigment numbers, the paint formulation, but it really depends on the binding agents that they use and kind of how they formulate the paints. So each brand is going to react differently, and then even each paint in that brand is going to react differently. So this is really just testing. And sometimes it's just going to be crazy and you're going to be like, oh my gosh, I did not expect that to move that far, and you're going to have to fix it. And that's fine. But you are going to have some paints. I'm just going to test a few here. Like it's just going to be kind of at random. So I'm going to put some yellow here. And this is a wet spot on my page. And you can see that yellow. It doesn't bloom crazy fast, but I just did one drop and it is spreading. And look how smooth and even that is spreading. It's not like concentrated in the middle. It's almost the same color throughout the whole splotch. Okay. So that's interesting, right? That I can just dab that in and it does that. And then I'm going to try some permanent rose. Okay. And you can see the permanent rose, these are all Winsor Newton. It gets more spidery. So that's a lot different. It spreads about the same amount, but you can see it's more concentrated on the middle where I touched it, and then it kind of gets spidery on the edges. Same paper, obviously, they're right next to each other, but very different results. So that's the paint formulation, okay? I'm gonna take a little bit of Winsor Violet. So this is a bluish purple. And it's similar to the permanent rose, but it doesn't go as far, okay? But it kind of spiders a little bit, okay? And I'm just kind of going down my palette here and picking, I'm not doing all of them, but I'm picking some of my paints here, okay? And I'm just kind of showing you the difference, okay? So that moves even less. It's kind of crazy. And there are different brands that are known to just move more. And it's also going to depend on water control, how much water's on your brush, how much water's on the page, all of that. But I mean, like cobalt, right? But then, so that's fine. If I know that though, then I know that I might want to do a few extra taps around to get a bigger spread. Okay. Now, as this dries, it's not going to spread as much either. So I can kind of add a little bit more water to the page again. So this was lots of tapping, right? I know I have some paints in here that move a lot. I just can't remember at the moment which ones. I have it written down. But yeah, so this is something that you can kind of test for yourself too, and just see, like, if I just do one drop of paint with different amounts of water, what's gonna happen? And there, again, are different paints, like Core is a brand of watercolor paints, professional paints. I haven't used them, but they're known for just like moving and exploding on the page. So Winsor Newton is a very traditional professional brand. And so their paints are gonna react almost fairly similar to each other. They're very consistent compared to some of the other brands that might be a little bit more wild, which is not a bad thing on either end. So it's just something to know when you're messing around with your paints and doing a painting. So yeah, so that's another way you can test kind of your paints, is looking at how they react to different amounts of water. And this was just one amount of water, but you could change it and add puddles. You could make the page almost dry and add really wet paint, really dry paint. And then you're gonna look at like different things like blooming too. So if I take my purple again and get really wet paint, and this is starting to dry now, you know, and I add that reacts completely differently, right? Because this is a lot more wet. And so it's gonna explode a lot more. And then you can add, you know, let's add paint to it and see what happens, or water to it and see what happens, and make it bloom. So these are all things that you can test for your paintings, or for your paints, so that you can then utilize them in completed paintings later. And until you are using the same palette a lot, you're not going to remember all of those things. I don't even remember all these things, and this is the palette that I use every day. But I do have a general idea of how my paints are going to react. And then, you know, if this were to happen and I didn't like it, before it dries, I'm just going to push it back, right? Ooh, that spread too much. I don't like that. Let's push it back. And then I can control it. So reacting quickly to what you're seeing too is going to be important, so that you prevent the staining problem. So this also isn't something that you necessarily need to memorize. You can keep cheat sheets. So I have my palette kind of drawn out on a piece of watercolor paper here. And then I have little codes. So I have opaque, semi-opaque, transparent. And then I wrote granulating, or gran, because I ran out of room, and staining on some of them. And so I know that I can just glance. I keep it just with a chip clip that's got a magnet on it on a little sidebar on my desk. And I just keep that hanging up there. So if I'm like, well, I don't remember, is this granulating? I can always use my little cheat sheet and look at it. So that is all information that you can typically find either on the packaging when you purchase your paints, or if you don't have that anymore, or it's not on there. If you look on the websites, it's going to give you a lot of that information. Different brands have more information than others, but they're generally going to give you that information. And then, you know, with your tests, you can add your own notes to that too, with like, oh, this one moves a lot, or this one stays put, and add some of those other properties that may not be part of the actual like properties of the paint that they are listed, but things that you're noting for yourself. So that pretty much wraps up this conversation about pigment properties and how they're related to color. So understanding how your paints react in layers, how they react to water, and how they shear out for transparency is all going to be very important to the overall look of the color of your finished painting as well. So this wraps up the kind of instructional portion of the color theory series. So if you've missed any of the videos, make sure you go back and check them out. This is the 6th video in the series, tons of information about color. So check those out. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, it'd be helpful. And in the comments, I want you to talk about, you know, do you like granulating paints? Which paints do you know that are kind of the movers on your page, or any questions that you have, leave them in the comments. I do have one more video that's going to wrap up this series. So if it's already out, it'll be next on the list. But if not, stay tuned, subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss it. It's going to be wrapping up the color theory series with doing a completed painting, looking at some of the different, or most of the different concepts that we talked about throughout this 6 video series. So make sure to stay tuned for that. And until next time, keep those paints flowing.